Thanks, Rock. Thank you, Annabeth. Wherever she went, we told them we're trying to lower the average age of the worship team, so we put her up there and knocked that down several decades. So we're thankful to her. One of the things that may surprise you, especially if you grew up like I did, is that people who specialize in languages will tell you that English is one of the hardest languages to learn, especially if you grew up and that was not like the primary language you heard as you were growing up. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, but one of the biggest reasons is that in English we have all these things that don't seem to make sense, especially to a non-native speaker. And one of the things that doesn't make sense is that we have several words in the English language that have multiple meanings. And I don't mean like words that sound similar that have multiple meanings. I'm talking about like the exact same word spelled the same way can have a lot of different meanings. In English, they're called homonyms. The dictionary defines a homonym as each of two or more words having the same spelling or pronunciation but different meanings and origins. So one way to think about it, most of these homonyms can either be a noun or a verb. Now, some of you look at me like, I can't believe I got up early to go to church to hear this. I promise I'm going somewhere, so hang with me here. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I brought some with me. I wanted to show you what I'm talking about. So for example, the word crane has several different meanings. A crane is a specific type of bird. It's also a piece of machinery. If you were going to build something, high off the ground, it's also something that you could do with your neck. It's a position you could be in with your neck. So it's the same word, spelled the exact same way, that has different definitions. Let's see. I've got a few more here I wanted to share with you, if I can get them out of the envelope. Here's one, fall. So we're entering into the fall of the year. The temperature's cooling off. So fall can be a season, or it can be something you do. If you trip and fall, that would be a noun and a verb, which will help you avoid that today, at least while you're on church property. Here's another one, park. So a park is a place you can go, right? You could take your kids, you could go to the park, or it's a thing you could do with your car, spelled the exact same way, pronounced the exact same way. Two different meanings. Let's see, a couple more. Ship. So if you wanted to send something to somebody, you would have to find a way to ship it there. Or a ship can be a big boat that you travel on. Let's do one more. Oh, this is my favorite. Bark. Bark is something that a dog does. That dog had allergies there. Bark is something that your dog does, sound your dog makes, or it's the outer layer of a tree. And it may have more meanings than that, but that's at least two. So you get the point. All of those are spelled the exact same way, they're pronounced the same way, and yet when you read them or you hear them, they can have different meanings. That means when you're reading something and you come across one of those words, in order to understand what's being said, you have to understand something about the context in which it's being used, because for words like that, the context always determines the definition. Now let me show you another word that has multiple meanings, especially in our culture, and I don't think it technically qualifies as a homonym, but you'll understand what I mean when I show you this word. It's the word success. That's a word that can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And the way you define success may be different than the way the people around you define success. It all depends on your context. It all depends on how you use the word. So for some people, success would be defined as the achievement of a certain goal. So there's something I wanted to do. I did that. I've been successful. Other people would say that success is really just, the ability to be your own boss, the ability to make your own decisions, the ability, the possessing a certain amount of money in the bank. That would be success. Some people associate success, especially in our culture, with a certain level of fame. So if I'm, semi-famous, at least I'm semi-successful. Other people would say, success is really nothing more than just, having a job that provides a steady paycheck and health insurance and having my own house, my own car, and that's what it means to be successful. I read this week, one prominent CEO said, success means having no idea what day of the week it is. Now, I don't know what he meant by that, but that was his definition. Now, the point is that how you define the word success will be determined by your context. So yours may look different than the person next to you. The person next to you may look different from mine, and that's just how it works. But there are two things that are almost always true. The first is that when most people think about success, it will be a combination of factors. So it's not enough just to be rich. I want to be rich and powerful. I want to be rich and powerful and, have a big house or whatever. Just all these different variables, all these different combinations of things that we think add up to success. The second thing that's almost always true is however you define the word success, it will almost always be a moving target. Let me give you an example of what I mean. A few years ago, the Gallup organization surveyed thousands of people, and they asked them, how much money would you need to make on a yearly basis for you to feel as if you were rich? So I want you to just think about that. You don't say it out loud, but just in your own mind on your piece of paper, write down the number. What would it take? What would you have to make an annual salary for you to feel rich? Here's what they found. This was so interesting. For those who were making $30,000 a year on average, they said they would need to make $74,000 in order to feel rich. So just a little more than double. For those making $50,000 a year, they said they would need to make $100,000 a year to feel rich. Now here's where it gets really interesting. For those surveyed who were already making $100,000 a year, they said they would need on average to have $5 million in assets to feel rich. Now, for those rare people that do have $5 million in assets to feel rich, guess how much they said they would need to feel rich? Not 10 million, but 20 million. So when it comes to money, rich is kind of a moving target. No matter how much money you have, you think you need more in order to feel rich. So you have this line in your mind, you reach that level only to discover that the line has moved. And every time you get close to it, it keeps moving, but it's not just money, it's everything. I mean, the people who come in second want to come in first. People who have one business want to have two businesses. People who live in a big house want to have a bigger house. People who own a certain number of acres want to own more acres. That's just what we do. That's why we've been in this series that we're calling Chasing Mirages, as Anita mentioned, because so much of our lives are spent chasing after stuff that's either always over the next horizon or around the next corner, but it never seems to be where we can grab it. But there is a better way to live. So if you have your Bible, I want you to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9, and this morning we're going to look at just a real brief part of a letter written by an early church leader named Paul to the church in Corinth that was filled with people who were, just like us. They're struggling to figure it out. And in this particular passage that we're going to look at, Paul is responding to some criticism that's been directed at him from some false teachers who have infiltrated the church there in Corinth. But what's so cool about this is that in response to their criticism, Paul very carefully defined for them, and by extension for us, what it meant for him to be successful. And what you'll see as we go through this is that Paul's definition of success has literally nothing to do with all the stuff that we spend our lives chasing after. He doesn't mention any of the things that most people mention when they talk about what it means to be successful. Now, as we work our way through this, just as a disclaimer, keep in mind that your definition of success will be dependent upon your context. So your personal definition will probably look different than Paul's. It'll look different than mine, and that's okay. So what I want us to focus on as we go through this is not necessarily Paul's definition of success, but more so the process of how he reached that point. See, for Paul to get to this point, Paul had to think through a lot of things in his life, and he had to go back and sort of redefine for himself what it meant for him to be successful. So I want us to focus on the process, and there are 3 steps in this process of redefining success. If you want to take notes, there's a outline on the bottom of your bulletin, or you'll find the one on the FCC app on your phone. But here's the first step in all this. You first have to identify the win. And here's what I mean by that. The truth is that if we were to go around the room, or if you were to ask most people, hey, what would it take for you to feel successful? Most people would say things like, well, I want to be rich. I want to be happy. I want to have some stuff. I want to be secure or comfortable, whatever it is. And beyond that, sort of those vague, sort of generalities, most people have never really answered that question. Most people have never thought through taken the time to think through, what would it look like for me to win? I mean, everybody wants to win. Everybody knows that winning is better than losing, but most people have never defined what it would look like for them to win. And that's why we feel so often as if we're chasing stuff that we can never catch, because we're not even sure what we're chasing. The Bible actually has a word for that. Back in the Old Testament, book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, who the Bible says was the wisest man who ever lived, he called that chasing the wind. Listen how he said this in Ecclesiastes chapter 2. He said, so I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Now keep in mind, the guy that wrote that already had all the stuff that we spend our lives chasing. He was wealthy, he was famous, he had power, he lived a very comfortable, secure lifestyle, and he had already had all this stuff, and yet he said, everything I do feels like I'm chasing wind. Now, how do you know if you're successful when it comes to chasing after the wind? You don't, because you can never catch the wind. And that's his point. Now, contrast that with what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. Here's what he says. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak. To win the weak I become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. So at the end of verse 19, Paul makes it clear that his goal, and he keeps returning to this over and over again throughout this paragraph, is to win as many people as possible. Now, if you know his story, you know that's not how it started. I mean, when we're first introduced to Paul, he's an enemy of the cross. He's made it his life's mission to sort of put the church out of business. The reason for that is because he thinks these early followers of Jesus are not only teaching false doctrine, but they're also upsetting the delicate balance of power between the Roman government authorities and the Jewish religious authorities. And so Paul makes it his life's mission to eliminate the church, eliminate Christianity. But then he has this incredible encounter with Jesus in Acts chapter 9 on the road to Damascus. And from that point forward, the way he identified the win for him, the way he defined success, changed in an instant. And one of the cool things about Paul is that because he wrote 13 of the 27 books that make up the New Testament, you can go back and you can read what he wrote at different times, and you can trace the development of his thinking regarding certain issues. So if you were here a couple weeks ago, we looked at something he wrote in Galatians 1 when we talked about approval. If you remember that, he said his whole life, his entire goal in life was not to please the people around him, but to please God and to live as a servant of Christ. Now, a few years later, he's writing this to the church in Corinth, and you see how he did that. Paul said, hey, for me, The win is to win as many people as possible to Jesus. Now, let me just stop there for a second and ask you, what is your win? If somebody said, hey, what would it mean for you to be successful? How would you know if you're achieving that? And again, your win might look different than Paul's depending on your context, but there are two things that should be a part of it no matter how you define it. First, whatever your win is, it should be focused on serving God. If you know Paul's story, then you know that after he encountered Jesus, he immediately walked away from a life that was filled with all the stuff that we're chasing. I mean, just like Solomon. He had a powerful position. He had a secure income. He had financial security. He was a famous teacher. I mean, he had everything that you want, he already had. But then he walks away from all that. And the question is, why would he do that? And the answer is in verse 23. He says, the reason he walked away was for the sake of the gospel. He wanted to spend his life, instead of serving himself, he wanted to spend his life serving God. But there's another piece to this that's just as important. And not only should your win be focused on serving God, it should also be focused on serving people. And that's where it gets a little bit hard. When you look at the paragraph that we just read, Paul goes through and he identifies 3 different groups of people that he's focused on winning. So the first group he names are the Jews. That's kind of Paul's home crowd. These are the people who grew up like him. They speak the same language that he speaks. They've read the same books, heard the same sermons, sang the same songs, and so he can identify with them pretty easily. Then the second group he calls are the people he says are without the law. We would call them Gentiles. So these are people who didn't grow up following all the same rules and going to the same services and reading the same books. And so for Paul to connect with those people, for Paul to reach those people, he's got to change his approach up a little bit. He can't approach them like he would approach the Jews. Then finally he identifies this group that he calls the weak. And what he's talking about there are people who struggle with this balance between law and grace. They're people who should know better, but because of a lot of different reasons still struggle with legalism. But here's the point in all this. If we had a time machine, right, and you could go back to the first century and you could ask Paul, say, Paul, what is the goal of your life? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? What does it mean to you to win? Paul could have answered that question. He said, hey, for me to win would be to win as many people as possible to Jesus. But then he takes it a step further and he names the people that he's trying to win. Nothing vague. It's not like, hey, we're just going to win a bunch of people. I mean, he names 3 different groups of people that he's focused on winning. Now here's the question for you and for me. What's our win? What would it look like for us to win? If it's just you and me, and we're sitting across the table from one another, and I asked you that question, could you answer it? Could you answer it in one sentence like Paul did? Could you say, hey, here's what this looks like for me? And if you could, would your answer have anything to do with serving God and serving other people? Or would you do what most people do and define it in terms of how you could serve yourself? See, here's what most of us do, and you know this is true because you've done it and I've done it too. Most people define success in terms of what it means for them personally. So I've got to have this amount of money. I've got to own this kind of house. I've got to drive this kind of car. I'm going to take this kind of vacation. And I'm going to have more freedom, to do what I want, when I want to do it, and all that sort of stuff. And that's the kind of the way most people think when they think about success. But according to Paul, that's not really what it means to be successful. He already had all that stuff. He had all that stuff that we're chasing. And yet he walked away from it so that he could better serve God and serve people. I said earlier, your definition of success will probably look different than his and probably looks different from mine, but it should have those things in common. So for those of you who are parents, You need to ask yourself, what would it look like for me to win with my kids? What am I shooting for? I mean, what is it that I'm chasing after? If you're a person who has influence in your job, you need to ask yourself, what would it look like for me to win in my career? And it shouldn't just be more money and more stuff and more businesses. It should be something deeper than that. If you have people that work for you, you need to ask yourself, what would it look like for me to help the people that work for me win in their lives? What would that look like? But here's the deal. However you identify those wins in the various areas of your life, you have to keep in mind that real success, lasting success, will never be about you. It's always about how you serve God and how you serve the people around you in the context in which God has placed you. That brings us to the second step in this process, and it's this. Once you identify your win, you have to reorganize your life in a way that helps you achieve that win. So in our culture, we like to compartmentalize everything, and you know how you do this too. You have all these different compartments that make up your life, right? So you got your career or your job. Then over here you've got a compartment labeled family. Maybe there's one that says hobbies. Maybe there's one that says sports. I mean, whatever it is. And then because you're here today at 9 o'clock, you probably have one that says spiritual life. That's somewhere deep in there. And so as we go through life, the tendency is to think of all of these things as being separate from one another. I mean, you don't normally think about how your work life affects your spiritual life or how your hobbies affects your family life. I mean, we just tend to separate all those things and keep them far away from one another. But that's not the way Paul operated. Instead, every decision he made in every single area of his life revolved around his mission of reaching as many people as possible. Determine how he spent his money. You keep reading through 1 Corinthians, you'll see that. It determined how he traveled, where he went, who he connected to, how he related to people, the projects he took on. Everything in his life and every decision he made was done in service to his win, to his mission. So you get to verse 24, 1 Corinthians 9. Paul gets super practical, and he talks about how this is supposed to work once you've identified what it is you're chasing after, what it means for you to be successful. And to drive home his point, he uses the image of an athlete. Check this out in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body, and I make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. One thing's really important when you read the Bible. You have to remember, these letters that we look at, we kind of dig in and out of them, jump in and out of them. They were written by real people to real people that were gathered in real places. And so this letter, as I said earlier, was written by Paul to the church meeting in Corinth. And the reason that's important is because every other year, the city of Corinth hosted what was known as the Isthmian Games. They'd started back in 582 BC. And by the time of the first century rolled around, they were second only in prestige to the Olympics. And so the way this was worked, the way the schedule worked is that every year, either the year before the Olympics or the year right after the Olympics, they would hold the Isthmian Games in Corinth. And so what would happen is you would have many of the same athletes who competed in the Olympics would also arrive in Corinth and compete in the Isthmian Games as a way to further their training, further their careers. So every other year, the city of Corinth would fill up with all of these Olympic caliber athletes. This is what these people were used to seeing. They walk down the street and there would be all of these Olympic athletes gathered, ready to compete in the games. Now I'll be honest. I know some of you really get into the Olympics. Never been my thing. But just like everybody else, I'll tune in and watch a few events here and there. And whenever you do that, you know, I mean, when you turn on the TV and it's an Olympic year, you know that you're watching the best athletes in the world at that particular event. Unless it's curling, which probably shouldn't count as an Olympic sport, but that's just my 2 cents. But other than that, I mean, you watch those swimmers, you watch those downhill skiers, you know these people are the best in the world at what they do. Everybody that makes it to the Olympics endures years and sometimes decades of what Paul calls strict training. I mean, to make it to the Olympics, you have to spend a huge portion of your life saying no to some good things so that you can say yes to some better things. And on a smaller scale, you know how that works because at different points in your life, there's something that you wanted to achieve. There's something that you wanted to do. And so you had to reorganize your life, at least temporarily, so that you could accomplish your goal. But here's what's so crazy about this. You look again at what Paul said in verse 25. Paul says, everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. We all understand that part. But make sure you catch the very next line where he says, they do it to get a crown that will not last. Now think about that. You ever done that? Have you ever reorganized your life so that you could chase after a crown that you knew was not going to last? We all do that. We spend our lives chasing after money that's going to run out, houses that'll fall in, cars that'll rust out, farms that will one day be sold to somebody else, beauty that will eventually fade, and even jobs in which just, I don't want to break your heart, but this is how it works. The last day you walk out of your job, they're going to forget about you within 48 hours and replace you, no matter how long you work there. That is just how it works, and that is just what we do. We spend our lives chasing crowns that don't last. Now contrast that with the very next phrase in verse 25 when Paul says, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. What would it look like for you to reorganize your life in a way that you were chasing after something that would really last forever? And that's a really short list. Now, what would you need to do? What would you need to say no to so that you could say yes to some better things? Or how about this? What temporary crowns would you need to stop chasing to make time for you to chase something that will last forever? I mean, when you think about it, it's a no-brainer, right? But that's not the way we normally think about it. I have something I want to show you. Earlier, we're talking about these words that have more than one meaning. There's one more that I wanted to show you. And I don't, just like success, I don't think this technically qualifies as a homonym, like if you're an English major, but you'll understand what I'm saying. It is the word surrender. Now, almost always, when you hear this word, you think in terms of something negative. It is a word that almost always carries with it a negative connotation. So if you look it up in the dictionary, it usually says something like, to surrender means to accept defeat. You're like, man, I don't think that's what I want to do. Or something like to stop fighting and admit defeat. So if you're like me, the image that you think about, maybe to borrow Paul's image, is a boxer. He's getting beat up pretty good, and he knows, his corner knows as the fight's about over, so they throw in the towel. Or maybe you think about two armies that are on the battlefield, and one army is, defeating the other army. So eventually they wave the white flag of surrender and they admit defeat. Almost every time you hear this word, almost always negative. But there's another way to define the word surrender that's not quite so negative. We're going to put this on the screen. I looked it up this week just to make sure I was right. Surrender, to give up something or control over something. Or another way to think about it, the act of giving up something or giving control of something to someone else. Let me read that again. The act of giving up something or giving control of something to someone else. Do you know what Paul learned in the process of redefining what it means to be successful? He learned something that some of us need to learn, or maybe need to be reminded of. And it's the third step in this process. Sometimes you have to surrender to succeed. Sometimes you have to surrender to succeed. So because of his experience with Jesus, Paul came to a point in his life where he was willing to surrender his goals, his plans, his dreams for the future, and even his definition of what it means to be successful, so that he could get something better. And it's not that he accepted defeat. Instead, he surrendered and that he gave up control of his life to someone else. And for him, rather than being something negative, it became the best thing that ever happened to him. Because it enabled him to stop chasing after stuff that would never last for crowns that are eternal. Jesus said it like this, Matthew 16, "For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it." Then in the very next verse he says, "What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul?" I got a picture I want to show you. Some of you may have seen this guy on the news this past week. This is Herb Lusk. He passed away on Monday this past week at the age of 69. Now, if you're an NFL fan, you may remember him. He was the starting running back for the Philadelphia Eagles back in the 1970s, back when they were really rocking. His claim to fame is that he was the first NFL player to ever take a knee in the end zone after scoring a touchdown, which earned him the nickname the praying tailback. That was in August of 1977. 2 years later, fast forward 1979, the Eagles are in their preseason camp. You know, the teams get together before the season. They practice for a couple weeks, usually somewhere at a college. So he's in this dorm room, the second day of Eagles camp. He wakes up, he looks across the room at his teammate, and he says, "I can't play football anymore." 4 years into his professional career, really at the height of what he was expected to do. His teammate thought he was joking, but Herb Lusk got up, took a shower, went and ate breakfast. He then went and he met with his football coach, who was later to become a Hall of Famer, Dick Vermeil. Some of you remember him. And he told Dick Vermeil that he was leaving the team because he felt like the Lord had called him into ministry. Dick Vermeil could not believe that he was losing his starting running back to ministry. So he called the general manager. A couple hours later, had another meeting with Herb Lusk. They offered him more money and an extended contract if he would stay and be a part of the team. But Herb Lusk wouldn't budge. He stayed one more night at the campus. The next day, they flew in his dad, who happened to be a Baptist preacher, and his dad begged him not to quit the team, not to walk away from the NFL. And he said, "Ministry will always be there. Whatever you do, don't quit the team." But even his dad couldn't change his mind. Herb Lusk felt like the Lord had called him into ministry, and so he walked away from the NFL to become the preacher at a rundown church in Philadelphia called the Greater Exodus Baptist Church. His first Sunday, there were 18 people there. Keep in mind, a few months before that, he'd been carrying the ball at Veterans Stadium, 70,000 people cheering him on, chanting his name. And his first Sunday, there are 18 people at church. 20 years later, he was interviewed by a reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer, and by this point, he'd helped to reestablish the church. They were running about 300 on a Sunday. And he was asked, by this reporter, he said, "Do you ever regret leaving the NFL to come and preach at a small inner city church?" And I want you to listen to his answer. Here's what he said. He said, "It was not a step down going from the NFL to the church. It was a step up. My work is now eternal. I'm caring for people's souls, and that's way more important than carrying a football and making a lot of money." Can you hear the echo of what Paul said? They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. I want you to stand with me. And as you stand, I want you to ask yourself, what is it that I'm chasing after? What's the win? What's the crown? Is it something that's going to be exceedingly temporary, or is it something that's going to last forever? For some of us this morning, it'd be a good time to maybe think about how we define that word success, or maybe how we define that word surrender. Maybe today's the day we need to give up some stuff that we've been hanging on to so that we can chase after something that's better. So as we close, we're going to sing these final two songs. And if you want to pray with somebody or talk to somebody, just come down this front row. David and I would be glad to talk with you.